The words cut through the room before I had even finished my sentence. She is redundant, we are cutting her. I was standing at the head of the longest conference table I had ever seen, on the 42nd floor of Paramount Holdings, a slide still glowing on the screen behind me. My pointer hovered over a single figure, a number that represented 18 months of late nights, missed dinners, and quiet sacrifice. Quentin Ashworth said it the way a man flicks lint from his sleeve. Casual, certain. As though he were doing the entire syndicate Trust a favor by saying out loud what he assumed they were all thinking. 11 trustees turned to look at me. Not at him. At me. And for one long, suspended moment, the only sound in that room was the soft hum of the projector and the blood rushing in my own ears. Then, at the far end of the table, the chief trustee set down her pen. She did not say a word. She simply went cold, the kind of cold that lowers the temperature of a room without anyone touching the thermostat. I did not understand it yet. But Quentin Ashworth had just made the most expensive mistake of his career, and he had made it in front of the only person at Paramount who could not be charmed, bought, or fooled. Welcome to the payback office. This is the place where the people who get underestimated, talked over, and pushed aside finally get their moment. Not through shouting, not through revenge for its own sake, but through patience, competence, and the quiet receipts they kept all along. If stories like this one are why you're here, the channel is on its way to 7,000 of us building this corner together, and a subscribe helps more than you'd think. Now, let me take you back to how I ended up standing at the front of that room. My name is Serena Vanderlyn, and at the time, I was the Senior Strategy Associate at Paramount Holdings, the firm that managed billions on behalf of the Syndicate Trust. My title sounded impressive on a business card. What it actually meant was that I did the work 3 layers of leadership took credit for. I want to be clear about something before this goes any further. I did not come from money. My father repaired heating systems in the older neighborhoods on the east side of the city, and my mother ran the front desk at a community clinic for 29 years. We were never poor, there was always food, always a warm house, always a little set aside. But we were the kind of family that noticed people. My mother knew the name of every patient who walked through her doors, knew which ones came in scared and which ones came in alone. My father never left a job without making sure the elderly woman in the drafty house understood exactly what he'd fixed and why. That was the inheritance they gave me. Not wealth. Attention. The habit of seeing the person standing in front of you as a whole human being with a story instead of a line item to be managed. It made me good at my job in a way that the spreadsheets could never fully capture, and it made me terrible at the one thing Paramount seemed to reward most, the art of stepping on people on your way up. Quentin Ashworth had mastered that art. He was the director of strategic operations, my direct supervisor, and from the first week I reported to him, I understood the arrangement. My ideas would become his ideas. My analysis would carry his name on the cover page. And on the rare occasion something went wrong, my name would be the one attached to it. He was polished, expensively dressed, and gifted at saying very little in a way that sounded like a great deal. For 18 months, I had been building something I genuinely believed in. The Syndicate Trust held a portfolio of struggling ventures, and one of them, a regional logistics company the firm had nearly written off, had been quietly bleeding money for years. Everyone had given up on it, everyone except me. I had spent those 18 months learning that company down to its bones. I'd flown out to its warehouses. I'd sat with its floor managers. I'd built a complete recovery plan, the kind of plan that doesn't just look good in a boardroom, but actually works when real people have to execute it. And the morning of that presentation, I walked into Paramount Holdings, believing it would finally be the day my work spoke for itself. I had no idea Quentin had already decided exactly whose voice the room would hear. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor that morning was the last time I felt fully like myself for what would turn out to be a very long while. I arrived 90 minutes early, the way I always did before something that mattered. The trustees would not be assembling until 10, but I wanted the conference room to myself first. I wanted to walk the length of that table, click through every slide, and make certain that the projector connected on the first try instead of the fourth. Small things, The kind of preparation nobody ever sees and everybody assumes simply happens on its own. I had the recovery plan memorized so thoroughly that I could have delivered it in my sleep. 16 months earlier, the logistics venture had been on the firm's quiet list, the list of holdings nobody discussed in the hallways, because discussing them meant admitting a mistake had been made. The trust had acquired it at the top of the market, watched it stumble, and then more or less left it to die slowly while everyone found reasons to look elsewhere. I had not looked elsewhere. I had asked for the file nobody wanted, and I had read every page of it. What I found underneath the losses surprised me. The company was not broken. It was mismanaged, which is a very different thing. The warehouses were in the right places, the drivers were loyal, the contracts were salvageable. What it lacked was someone willing to sit with the unglamorous detail of fixing it, restructuring the routes, renegotiating 3 key supplier agreements, and replacing a leadership team that had stopped believing the business could be saved. I built the entire turnaround on paper, then I tested it against reality. I drove out to the largest distribution hub myself, 400 miles from the city, and I spent 2 full days walking the floor in steel-toed boots that I had bought specifically for the trip. I talked to a forklift operator, named Hollies, who had been there 19 years, and knew more about the operation's true bottlenecks than any consultant Paramount had ever hired. I sat in the break room and listened, not the way you listen when you're waiting to talk, but the way my mother listened at that clinic desk. By the time I came home, I did not have a theory. I had a plan that the people doing the actual work had already half-validated for me. Quentin knew about most of it, not all of it. I had learned, over those 18 months, to be careful about how much of myself I handed him at any one time, because everything I handed him had a way of reappearing under his name. But a project this size could not be hidden, and a month before the presentation, he had begun attending my update meetings. He asked few questions. He nodded a great deal. He took the printed summaries I prepared and slid them into a leather folder he never seemed to open in front of me. I told myself he was simply staying informed. That is the kindest interpretation, and I am the kind of person who reaches for the kindest interpretation first. It is, I have since learned, both my best quality and the one that has cost me the most. 3 days before the trustees were to convene, Quentin called me into his office. The view behind him stretched across half the city, and he sat with his back to it the way men like him always do, as though the skyline were merely set dressing for his importance. "The presentation," he said, steepling his fingers. "I think it's best if I open, set the strategic frame, then you can handle the operational detail." I should have heard the trap in the word detail. The way he set it apart, lowered it, made it sound like the part of the work that didn't quite require a mind. But I was grateful, in that moment, simply to be presenting at all. Associates rarely address the full trust. I thanked him. I actually thanked him. He smiled and told me he had complete confidence in me. I have replayed that smile many times since. The night before, I barely slept. I laid my clothes out the way I had as a child before the first day of school, a habit my mother gave me, pressing my collar flat and telling me that walking in prepared was a kind of respect, both for the room and for yourself. I thought about her as I set my shoes by the door. I thought about my father explaining a furnace to a frightened widow in language she could understand. I thought, tomorrow, I get to do work they would be proud of. I was right about that part. I just had the wrong idea about how the day would go. Because while I had spent the night rehearsing how to honor 18 months of work, Quentin Ashworth had spent his deciding that the cleanest way to claim it was to make cert I was no longer in the room to dispute who it belonged to. For a long moment, Adelaide Fenwick said nothing at all. She let the silence do work that words could not. She turned the capped pen slowly between 2 fingers, studying Quentin the way a person studies a hairline crack in something they had assumed was solid. The other trustees had gone very still. They knew her well enough to recognize that stillness, and they knew enough to stay out of it. "Mr. Ashworth," she said at last. Her voice was unhurried, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. "You'll forgive an old woman her curiosity. The supplier renegotiations you described, the 3 contracts at the Northern Hub. Walk me through the second one." Quentin smiled the smile of a man who had not anticipated the question. Of course, the second supplier agreement. We approached it from a position of leverage, identified the inefficiencies, and... Which supplier? The smile held, but something behind it began to slip. I'd have to consult my notes for the specific. The penalty clause, Adelaide continued, as though he had not spoken. The one that would have cost the venture roughly $400,000 had it been triggered during the transition. How did your plan address it? The room understood before Quentin did. I watched it happen. I watched 11 trustees realize, in something close to unison, that the man who had just narrated an 18-month turnaround in the first person could not answer a single concrete question about it. He reached for his leather folder. He opened it for the first time in my presence. He looked down at pages I knew did not contain the answer, because the answer lived in my analysis, and he had never once read it closely enough to absorb it. I'd want to be precise, he managed, rather than speak from memory. Yes, Adelaide said, precision would be welcome. Then she turned to me, and her expression changed, not warm exactly, but clear, the way the sky clears after something heavy has passed through. I am told that in moments of genuine shock, people often say something foolish. I managed to avoid that only because, for several seconds, I could not say anything at all. Run the venture, I finally repeated. The words felt unfamiliar in my mouth. The recovery division, Adelaide said. I want you to build it and lead it, not as an associate, not reporting to a director who files your work under his own name, as its head, reporting directly to me and to the trust. She paused. I want to be precise, because I have learned that vague offers attract vague people. So let me be exact about what I am offering you. What she described over the next several minutes rearranged my understanding of my own future. She was offering me a division of my own, a mandate to take the 11 abandoned holdings and triage them, the way an emergency room triages patients. The authority to assemble my own team. A budget that, when she named the figure, made me grateful I was already sitting down. A seat at the table where these decisions were made, instead of a place near the lectern where decisions were announced to me. And a title that would report to no one but the chief trustee herself. It was, in every measurable way, several levels above the job Quentin Ashworth had just told the entire trust I was too redundant to keep. Why me? I asked. It was the honest question, and I have always believed in asking the honest question even when a more flattering one is available. You have people who have done this for 20 years, people with the right pedigree. Why hand something this size to an associate you watched present for the first time this morning? Adelaide considered the question as though it deserved consideration, which I appreciated. Because the people who have done this for 20 years are precisely the people who created the list, she said. They are very good at the parts that look impressive in a boardroom and very bad at the parts that require sitting with a forklift operator long enough to learn what is actually wrong. They manage from the 42nd floor. You bought boots. She let that land. And because this morning I watched a man try to take everything from you in front of 11 witnesses and you did not raise your voice once. You answered the question. People who answer the question instead of raising their voice are rarer than you would think, and they are exactly who I want running something that cannot afford theater. I thought of my mother at the clinic desk. I thought of my father explaining a furnace to a frightened widow. Attention, the habit of seeing the person standing in front of you, it had never once felt like a professional qualification. It had simply felt like who we were. And now, the chief trustee of the syndicate trust was telling me it was the most valuable thing I had brought into that building. There is one more thing, Adelaide said, and her voice cooled by a degree. It concerns Mr. Ashworth. I waited. The recovery division will need to draw on resources currently sitting inside strategic operations, analysts, data systems. Several of the holdings on the list passed through his department over the years, which means a portion of the records you'll require are under his control. She studied me. Which is to say, the man who tried to end your career this morning is about to find that his department is being reorganized to support the very division you'll be leading. He'll be expected to cooperate. With you. I confess that a part of me, a small, ordinary human part, felt something warm at that. I am not made of stone. But I had learned a long time ago that the satisfying thing and the wise thing are rarely the same thing, and that the people who confuse the two tend not to last. I won't make it about him, I said. If I take this, I take it for the 11 companies, not to settle a score. Adelaide looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, approval, I think, though she was not a woman who handed approval out cheaply. That, she said, is the answer that confirms I've chosen correctly. The ones who take it to settle the score always do, eventually, and it always costs them more than the score was worth. She rose from her chair, which I understood to mean the conversation was reaching its end. But I'll tell you something, Serena, free of charge, from someone who has watched men like Quentin Ashworth for half a century. You will not have to do a single thing to make him suffer. She paused at the window, the river behind her. He will do it entirely to himself, the moment he learns who is now standing above him. And I would very much like to be in the room when he does. The news traveled through Paramount the way news always travels through a building full of ambitious people, quietly at first, then all at once. I did not announce it. Adelaide did, in the measured way she did everything. A short memorandum went out to the firm 3 days after that morning in the conference room. The Syndicate Trust was establishing a recovery division, effective immediately, to be led by Serena Vanderlyn, reporting directly to the chief trustee. There was no mention of Quentin Ashworth. There was no mention of a presentation. There did not need to be. Everyone who mattered had been in that room, and the ones who hadn't been there had heard the story by lunch. I learned later that Quentin received the memorandum at his desk, with the same view of the city behind him that he had used to make himself feel large. I was not there, but I did not need to be, because the building has its own nervous system, and the story of how he reacted reached me within the hour. He had read it twice. He had stood. He had walked to his window and stayed there a long time. I did not enjoy that as much as I had expected to. That surprised me. I had imagined, in the early hours after Adelaide's offer, that I would feel some clean, satisfying triumph. What I felt instead was something quieter and more useful. The absence of fear. For 18 months, I had managed every interaction with that man around the constant low awareness of what he could do to me. That awareness was simply gone. I did not need to bring him down. I had been lifted past him, and from up there, he was a much smaller figure than he had seemed when he stood between me and the daylight. Our first meeting under the new arrangement came the following week. I had requested the records, the files for 4 of the 11 holdings that had passed through strategic operations over the years. By every protocol, those files belonged to the firm, not to Quentin, and the request went through the proper channels with Adelaide's authority behind it. He could not refuse. But he could delay, and he did, in the small ways that men like him use to remind everyone that they have not entirely surrendered. The files arrived incomplete. 2 key folders were still being located. A data export I needed arrived in a format that could not be opened. So I went to see him. I want to describe that walk to his office honestly, because it mattered to me. I did not go in to gloat. I went in dressed the way my mother had taught me, collar flat, prepared, and I went in carrying nothing but a single sheet of paper listing exactly what I needed and by when. I had decided, before I ever reached his door, that I would give him no theater to react to. The most powerful thing I could be, in that room, was completely calm. He was standing when I entered, which I noted. He had not stood for me in 18 months. "Serena," he said. The warmth was still there in his voice, but it had a brittle quality now, like ice over moving water. "Congratulations, quite a turn of events." "Thank you," I said. I set the sheet of paper on his desk. "These are the 4 files I still need. The Brightwater records, the 2 warehouse leases, and the supplier data in a format that opens. I'd like them by Thursday." He glanced at the paper without picking it up. "These things take time. My team is stretched. You understand efficiency." He said the word lightly, almost as a private joke, and I understood he was testing whether it still had the power to wound me. It did not. "I do understand efficiency," I said evenly. Which is why I'd hate to bring an incomplete records issue to Adelaide and have her wonder whether strategic operations is the right department to be holding trust files at all. I let that sit, gently, without heat. Thursday works better for everyone, I think. Something passed across his face then, the recognition, perhaps, that the dynamic he had relied on for 18 months had not merely shifted, but reversed entirely. The threat I had just made was the kind he had made to me 100 times in softer words. The difference was that mine was true, and we both knew it, and I had said it without raising my voice. Thursday, he said quietly. I thanked him again, sincerely, because I had meant it, and then I did the thing I think unsettled him most of all. As I reached the door, I turned back. Quentin, the recovery work is going to need good analysts. Whatever else is true between us, your department has some of the best in the building. When this is done, I'd be glad to have a few of them on real turnarounds, work they can put their actual names on. I paused. The offer's open, I mean it. I left him standing at his window with that. I have thought since about why I made the offer. Part of it was strategy. The best analysts genuinely were in his department, but most of it was simpler than that. It was the inheritance again, the habit of seeing the whole person, even the one who had tried to erase me. I was not going to become him in order to defeat him. The recovery division was not glamorous. I want to be honest about that, because the morning in the conference room makes a tidy story, and tidy stories can leave out the part where the real work begins. There were no dramatic confrontations after that. There rarely are. What there was instead was 18 more months of warehouses, of break rooms, of files read all the way to page 31. I assembled a team of 9, and I chose them the way Adelaide had chosen me, not for pedigree, but for the willingness to buy the boots. 2 of them came from Quentin's department in the end. They turned out to be exactly as good as I had suspected, and they did their best work the moment their names started appearing on the things they built. We took the 11 holdings one at a time. 3 of them were genuinely broken, and I recommended the trust let them go, because seeing the whole picture clearly sometimes means admitting a thing cannot be saved, and a recovery division that saves everything is not being honest. But the other 8 were like the logistics venture. Mismanaged, not dead, full of people who had simply been waiting for someone upstairs to remember they existed. Holly's got promoted, by the way. The forklift operator who knew more than the consultants. When the logistics company stabilized, the new leadership created an operations advisory role, and I made sure his name was the first one mentioned. He sent me a short note afterward, in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper. He thanked me for listening. I have kept it. As for Quentin Ashworth, I told you that Adelaide said he would do the work of his own undoing, and she was right. I never had to move against him. I never wanted to. But a department whose director claims credit he cannot defend tends to develop cracks. And once the trustees had watched him fail to answer a single question about his own supposed work, those cracks were noticed everywhere. His authority did not collapse in a single dramatic afternoon. It eroded, meeting by meeting, request by request, as people quietly stopped routing the important things through him. Within the year, he took a position at a smaller firm. The announcement used the word opportunity. Everyone understood. I did not celebrate it. By then, I genuinely did not have the energy to spare. I was 3 turnarounds deep and learning the supplier contracts of a regional manufacturer that employed 2,000 people. His departure registered as a small, distant thing. That, I think, is the truest measure of how far I had come. The man who had once stood between me and the daylight had become a footnote in a life that was now far too full to dwell on him. Adelaide and I still meet. She is past 80 now and has stepped back from the day-to-day, but she keeps a chair for me when I visit, and she still asks the unglamorous questions. The last time, she asked me whether I had ever, even once, wished I had said something sharper in that conference room, some perfect cutting line to put Quentin in his place in front of the trust. I told her the truth. I told her that the most powerful thing I did that morning was not say anything sharp at all. I simply knew the answer to the question. Page 31. That was the whole of my revenge, and it turned out to be more than enough. She smiled at that, the way my father used to smile at a repair done right. If there is something to take from all of this, It is the thing my parents handed me long before I ever set foot on the 42nd floor. They never taught me how to climb over people. They taught me to see them, the patient in the clinic, the widow with the broken furnace, the forklift operator who knew where the real problems lived. I walked into the most important room of my life believing my work would speak for itself, and it didn't, not at first. A man spoke over it and tried to bury it. But the work was real, and the records were real, and page 31 was exactly where I said it would be. In the end, the truth did not need me to raise my voice. It only needed me to have done the work honestly, and to be standing there, calm and prepared, when someone finally thought to ask. The people who get talked over and pushed aside do not always get a conference room and a chief trustee. I know that. But competence kept quietly, documentation kept carefully, and dignity kept intact, those things have a way of waiting for their moment. And when the moment comes, they do not shout. They simply answer the question. That is the whole story. Thank you for staying with me to the end of it. These stories take real time to tell, and the fact that you're still here means more than you know. If this one resonated, the channel is climbing towards 7,000 of us who believe the quiet, competent people deserve their reckoning too. Subscribing keeps these stories coming, and it helps the next person who needs to hear one find their way here. I'll see you in the next one.